Hello, everybody, and welcome to our today's BWO expertise on the auction results for the centrally pre-inspected sites. My name is Stefan Timm. I'm the Managing Director of the Federal Association of Offshore Wind Energy in Germany, the BWO, or as we call it in German, the Bundesverband Windenergie Offshore. You have already recognized I'm speaking English today. Initially, we planned to hold this BWO expertise again in German, but the interest from abroad prompted us to switch it to English. So, yeah, we are happy and welcome our guests from abroad. You all already also have recognized that I'm not alone today. Today, Manuel Battaglia is with me. Manuel is our office manager, and he's the responsible writer of our position papers about any topic about energy policy, for the tender design, for the energy market design, and he is also the chair of the working group. Yeah, our expert today from inside. As you already know, yeah, welcome, Manuel. As you already know, we usually have external experts in our BWO expertise sessions. And therefore, I'm very pleased to welcome Simon Müller. I don't really have to introduce you, Simon, but you are a very well-known expert. I don't want to read your vita today, but you are the director of Agora Energiewende in Germany. And some of you might already know, he's a member of the advisory board of BWO. Welcome, Simon. And you are supported by Mira Wenzel as a telephone joker in the background in case of any difficult questions that we altogether can't answer. Yeah, due to the current discussion, we also have decided, in consultation with you, Simon, to speak about the electricity market presented by the BMWK in the beginning of August this year. This will be done somehow in the Q&A later on. Also, yeah, now let's have a look on the schedule. After my short introduction, we will hear your lecture, Simon, about the auction results. After this, there will be plenty of time for your Q&A, the question and answers, not the answers, but maybe the questions of our audience. So, yeah, please type your questions in the chat of this meeting room. At 11:30, this expertise will be closed. Enough time for you all to check some emails and then have lunch. Yeah, when we come to talk about the tenders, BWO has 4 major goals I would like to mention first. First is we want to ensure a high probability of realization of the projects. The second goal is that we want to preserve diversity of stakeholders. The third, we want to strengthen the European value chain for offshore wind energy in Europe. And last but not least, we want to de-risk the projects and ensure the investment security. Therefore, we see several instruments. Some of them I want to mention, not all of them, because this is not a lecture about the BWO proposals, but you should have heard them. That's important for us to ensure the diversity of stakeholders. We pledge that the sites that can be won by one bidder is limited to 1, and the size of the site should be limited to 1 gigawatt to ensure that there are enough sites in each tender round. Also, we pledge for strengthening the role of qualitative criteria, non-price criteria, and we want to use the income of the auctions to strengthen the value chain and especially the port infrastructure in Germany. Yeah, de-risking means for us that we want to reduce or even better eliminate unproductive risks such as price risks and weather risks, at least for a part of the auctions. This could happen, for example, via CFD, a very well-known instrument, or any other equivalent instruments, such as discussed in the BMWK electricity market paper. Simon, we will come to this later on. Yeah, last but not least, we pledge for realistic implementation deadlines and appropriate penalties in the system to ensure the realization. Thank you for listening to our proposals, and now we come to the point which is very interesting for you, and I would like to hand over to Simon. Simon, you have prepared some PowerPoint, and my team will now switch to the charts, or you do it yourself, I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan. I'm happy to share the presentations, the slides myself. First of all, a very warm welcome, hello, also from my side. I'm very happy to be here today to share some of our preliminary thoughts and assessments of the most recent round of the German offshore tenders. What I'll be presenting to you builds on work that we've done at Agora Energiewende looking at offshore wind, summarized in a recent publication that we brought out in July that also looks at some of the current challenges that we see for offshore wind moving forward and some of the strategies, some of the policy levers that are there to mitigate those challenges. I'll start sharing my screen now, and I hope this will work. So here we go. Before I go into the slides, first, a special thank you to Mira Wenzel. She's the responsible analyst and project lead here at Agora Energiewende, focusing on offshore wind. And second, I would like to start by saying that I'm actually quite happy that we're doing this in English today due to the interest that we have also beyond Germany. I think Europe has one world-class, really world-class renewable energy resource, and that's the extended continental shelf that we have in the North Sea. And international European collaboration really is essential to make the best of this resource collectively. Before I go into the analysis of the results, many of you will be familiar with Agora Energiewende, some of you might not. So who are we? We're a think tank and policy lab, at this point part of the Agora Think Tanks group, where we not just look at the energy sector, including buildings, but also industry, agriculture, and together with a partner think tank, transport. So we cover the full suite of sectors that are needed for climate neutrality. What we do is developing scientifically sound and politically feasible proposals for how the transition to climate neutrality can work. And we work on this independently in a non-partisan way, really committed to climate action and with a diverse financing structure, mainly through philanthropic grants. And we not only work from Berlin, but also from offices in Brussels, Beijing, and Bangkok. So let's put things into perspective in a first go. Offshore wind in Germany, where are we coming from and where do we want to get to? We see here the ramping up of the deployment capacity, and I'm showing this to highlight the point that the industry in Germany, of course, has seen quite a number of ups and downs in the past. And of course, in a sector that has such long lead times and project development times, it's quite an issue. And also, we haven't had the amount of consistency that is needed with the auctions coming out regularly to really ensure a steady deployment. I think the negative record that we had in 2021 with really no connection of meaningful additional capacity in that year. But of course, Germany is on a trajectory to change this. There are quite ambitious targets out to 2030 and 2045. And in order to reach these targets, substantial ramp up will be required. You see here the expected commissioning for each calendar year. And then there's some delays that are already expected in 2029, the light blue shading that you see here. And then some of this is pushed back to the year 2030. Personally, I think really this kind of summing up in one single year does create quite a bit of a challenge because it's a kind of single occurrence. Of course, in the end, it's the overall European picture that counts, but really having a steady deployment trajectory is still among the most important things for ramping up industrial capacity. Why? Right now, those supply chains are not sufficient and competition for them is increasing. That's, in our view, just jumping ahead a little bit, one of the reasons why we might see lower yields in the most recent auctions because prices are going up. And of course, this kind of lack of having a stable trajectory and this kind of peak at 1 year makes it difficult to really have the right amount of capacity in place. This is not something that is a German issue at all, but we're talking about a really European challenge because also the manufacturing base is taking place all across Europe. And many of you will know these numbers from about a year ago, sourced from different analyses. Turbines, there's a need to double the amount of units that can be manufactured with foundations, even more strong, quadrupling, and also cables need to go up substantially. If we look at the analysis from Wind Europe, we have a 7 gigawatt capacity for annual deployment, but that needs to go up to 24 gigawatts if we want to meet the targets in the years to come. So much for the general context and where we want to get to. In the next step, I'd like to share with you an overview of the auction results. First, a more descriptive component, and then actually in the next step, we'll go into the analysis. And because it's really interesting to see how these have developed over time, I'll start by sharing with you the results from last year. Here we had the big surprise of very, very high payments in the tenders in June in the not centrally pre-examined areas. And of course, there already was a little bit of a question, okay, how much of this can really be done profitably? What are the assumptions behind this? And of course, also the auction design kind of encouraged that we see very, very high bids. Then a few months later on, we had the results in August with the centrally pre-examined areas. And here it's a little bit difficult to draw conclusions because there have been pre-existing entry rights in these areas that, in our perspective, have kind of biased the results. If we go then to the tenders of this year, one thing to note is that in terms of the volumes, we see a reversal. While in the past year, it really was the not centrally pre-examined areas that showed the dominant capacity, in this year, it was this category where we saw most of the gigawatts out for tender. We already observed a reduction in the prices that were paid in the summer auction, but now in August, we really had a very, very strong drop that I personally also found quite striking. And some of the explanations for this, the possible explanations, I'll come to later. Just to summarize a little bit what was happening in these auctions from this month, results published on the 12th of August, so just a few weeks ago. We had the total of 5.5 gigawatts. And then, of course, for the first time, the real application of qualitative criteria in addition to one price criterion. The price criterion still being the most substantial one with the 60%, but of course in one single bid. And then the qualitative criteria that most, if not all of you, will be familiar with. So one is the contribution to the decarbonization of the buildup of wind energy in itself, so measured by the share of electricity demand in the manufacturing process that's met from renewables. Then the amount that is already secured via long-term contracts to companies, the foundation technology used in a more environmentally friendly way, and then in a attempt to kind of picture the ramp up also of the skilled labor base, the amount of apprentices or people in vocational training in the relative companies. So these were the criteria there that were applied. So much for the assessment of the results themselves. But of course, now the interesting point is the analysis looking into what was going on to lead to these results. And before I go into this, based on the stakeholder consultations that we've had, the conversations that we've had to look into what was driving these results, at this point, I would say we can make an informed speculation and derive some hypotheses, but also from our side, we still have a number of questions. And I think in the following discussion, it will be very interesting also for some of the participants to share hypotheses, insights, to kind of use this opportunity of being here together today to also deepen our understanding of what was driving this difference in the clearing prices and the outcomes of the auctions. On the left side, you just see a summary of the information that I already shared. So we have the price in euros per megawatt that was paid. I think in this overview, you see the very strong drop on the most recent auctions in August as far as information is available. So of course, the first point is that the willingness to pay, or the offer that is actually done, is much lower. Now, what are the explanations that we see a lower financial yield to what the government is getting per megawatt? First of all, I think what's very clear, and that's analytically, something that one can immediately see, we have somewhat lower quality sites that were out for tender in this round. And of course, this leads to higher LCOE and hence lower willingness to pay. The other is, I already mentioned initially that we see the strains on the supply chain, competitions for all the different services, the components that are needed, hence prices going up, costs going up. And again, this will result in lower willingness to pay. On the next slide, I'll share a little bit something on market prices. And of course, also here, the final point, the design of the auction is quite different. Because of course you only make one single bid, which doesn't lead really to this strong incentive to really maybe push the limit of what you're willing to pay that we saw in the auctions for the not centrally assessed sites. In addition to this, one can also speculate that, of course, the inclusion of the qualitative criteria leads to an indirect competition and also can drive up costs somewhat. Which is then priced in. And again, a word on the qualitative criteria, it's because it's not just the willingness to pay that was looked at here. One can see that this is a way of creating innovation and also getting back some of the otherwise applicable producer rents. But we could speak more about this in the Q&A, whether the criteria that have been applied in this round really lead to the type of innovation that is needed for the sector. Now, I'll go through a little bit more in detail about the various possible reasons that we see. One just general observation, what we did here is we looked at the prices on forward electricity markets for different products. So the starting point here, you see, is always the actual date of the auction or immediately before. And then you see what was the expected market price, or what was the market price that was applicable at that time. And you see between 2023 and 2024, we do see a general reduction of the expected market price. Now, of course, the commissioning dates for the facilities will lie past this, but still there is a strong anchoring effect that we see, or for some of the projects will I be after this, we see a strong anchoring effect from those observable market prices to the bid. So this is one possible explanation. Now let's look at the attractiveness of the areas. And I think this is a topic that is really rising to the top level of attention when it comes to planning the further build out of offshore wind in Germany. There's a centrally planned designation and planning of areas, which I think has a huge number of advantages. At the same time, it makes very, very important the criteria that are applied by the responsible authority, the BSH, when they designate different sites for offshore wind. And actually, what we see is there is a target of 70 gigawatt, which is currently being allocated to Germany's exclusive economic zone, despite the fact that this zone is relatively small in comparison to other countries if you look at the amount of capacity that should go there. And we see studies predicting a drop in the full load hours that are applicable. And also, if you look at how the sites are designated, we also see that the yield per site differs quite strongly. And of course, there are effects if, for example, in neighboring countries, say the Netherlands, we have projects coming online or maybe planning changes that will then have an influence on the returns that can be achieved because the produced energy goes down. Just a little bit of history. Actually, as Agora Energiewende, we were quite early to flag this effect. Already in 2020, we were looking at this and we saw quite a strong reduction in the possible yields. I won't go through everything that is mentioned here on the slides, but in a very high density scenario, we really saw a strong drop, cutting the yields almost in half. So this is a significant effect that is currently, as we can see, not yet fully recognized in the way that the system is being planned. Again, here, very happy to look into this during the discussion. Now, if we want to change this, if we want to use the space more efficiently and reduce the negative impact coming from wake effects, of course, the cooperation and coordination between different European states will be critical. Now, the problem is experience shows that if you look at the time period since the first renewables directive came into force in 2009, it's always been the cooperation between countries that has been somewhat cumbersome to realize. Not just because the question of how do we allocate costs is difficult, but actually agreeing also on how do we share the benefits. If you look at different project types, of course, you're all familiar with the hybrid projects that also serve as an interconnector, so that are shared between different jurisdictions. ENTSO-E does expect that these play a role in 2050, seeing 14% of these projects overall. But still, if you look at, especially for the country of Germany, the significance of these wake effects, it's clear that we need to go beyond this in order to make the most efficient use of the offshore wind resource. But of course, there's a lot of factors that are at play, which hybrid connections will be best suited. And then and also the changes to the legal framework that are necessary can be quite complex. Stefan mentioned initially, there was also a question put to us, okay, how is the stakeholder diversity evolving? And if we look at the existing and new owners of offshore wind capacity, what we can see is that in particular, new players have come into the game with past auctions. So overall, you can say in this stage, we see a diversification of the players overall, if you count in who's already there. But of course, at the same time, if you look at the companies that are successful in the auctions, there is a somewhat stronger concentration to those who can really also shoulder very, very large projects. But of course, this comes with the technology, with very long lead times, very big projects, where of course such expertise is quite valuable. If we look at the competition, how it's evolving, we only had about 5 bids for the 3 sites in the August tenders. We had 8 bids in June of this year. So we do see that the appetite has gone down somewhat. Again, here, linked to possible challenges. I already mentioned some of them, the market situation, of course, also the different criteria applied and lower expected full load hours. If we then look at, okay, how is it with the application of these qualitative criteria that have now been put into place? The table below is just very basic and kind of shows, okay, what can you get from the different procedures? And of course, in principle, you can have a competition for ideas with the qualitative criteria. One needs to see whether this has been fully leveraged. But going through these steps one by one, I think it's quite difficult to assess the performance of the qualitative criteria at this stage already, because of course it's a confounding effect with only having one single financial bid, right? So the whole setup of the auction, more than one thing changed compared to the auctions that we saw in June. Of course, there also can be a financial component flowing from the qualitative criteria, right? If you need additional money to increase your score on these. And something that's quite unfortunate when it comes to the auction results, we would have loved to dig deeper into this, but there hasn't been transparency really from the Federal Network Agency in Germany to show how these were weighed individually and what led to the overall outcome. Okay, you see quite initial assessment of what was going on in the auctions. I'd like to spend the remainder of the presentation looking ahead and seeing, okay, what do we need to do in order to secure the build-out? First of all, how will things continue? We've now allocated all the areas and all the capacities that are needed for the 2030 target. In the coming years, we will see approximately 2 and 2 gigawatt, slight shuffle there between 2025 and 2026 in the pre-assessed and the non-pre-assessed areas. Looking at the lot size, it means that a maximum of 2 bidders, 2 entities will be awarded a contract. Here, just a jump a little bit to the publication that I mentioned initially. If we look at, okay, what is needed to really kind of get the build out on track, we've identified short, medium, and long-term priorities that are relevant in order to secure the build out. This builds on a first part of the report that looks at the status quo of the industry, where we see bottlenecks, then looks at the risks for further expansion, and then identifies mitigation strategies. We will be presenting the main results of this report also at an event that you're happy to participate in. You should have received some information about this. Otherwise, we will be sending reminders for this as well. I'll share some of the most important results of the study with you at this point. The study itself is in German. So first of all, it's clear we need the investment in the supply chain in order to reach the targets. There's a gap between ambition and where we stand. I already spoke about this in the first part of the presentation. Second, in order to deal with this issue, it's very important to strengthen the supply chain in a swift and focused manner. We have a number of concrete proposals in the study here, really just a rough overview, for example, by having improved guarantee and loan programs, especially for mid-sized enterprises, among other things. And then if we look at the tender design itself, I think we already see at the horizon that we can enter a stage where if costs go up, the expected market revenues go down, there can be a moment where a financial kind of safety net becomes more important again. And so an evolution of the auction design we see as an important priority, going to a two-sided hedging instrument in line with the most recent changes on the EU level. And then last point, last but really not least, in order to get to the 70 gigawatt target efficiently, it's of great importance to enhance cooperation and really make sure that this capacity is spread more evenly. And of course, also looking at the energy actually generated, not just putting capacity for the sake of capacity, but focusing on the energy yield that is there. Here, second to last slide, just to share with you, where do we see the main risks? We have the short-term risk. Sorry, there's just a few German words without a translation. On the left side, we have the longer-term risks on the right side, and then we have increasing intensity going up. And as you can see, the supply chain is the most significant short-term risk, then moving to the international cooperation for the longer time horizons. And something that I haven't spoken about here, but again, we can pick it up in the discussion, the way that actually the winners of the tenders need to pay out the remuneration to the government can, which is over time, can create an incentive for this option-based bidding, then potentially abandoning projects. And there one needs a mechanism to actually hand over projects to make sure that they actually get constructed. If we look at next steps in terms of the revision of the auction design, we see one, if we look at the guidance and the requirements from the European level, avoiding the unlimited negative bids is something that needs to be implemented in the design. I think this is an important point to avoid a kind of winner's curse, which can then also undermine realization probability. Then the use of qualitative pre-qualification and tendering criteria. Germany already is doing this, but then evolving these further, and of course boosting the possibility of that projects actually do get realized. Also, as already mentioned, evolution of the design more towards a double-sided hedging instrument. We can speak more about how to really do this, whether production-based, not production-based, and so forth. And it's very, very obvious that since this is really a European resource, the European level is very, very important in this. And a stronger European harmonization, of course, is also important to get costs down and competitiveness up. All right, so these were the points that I wanted to share with you. I hope there were interesting insights for you in there. And now I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Hi, Simon. Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. And I already recognized that our audience was very active. And we have, yeah, I guess we have plenty of questions for you. So, but before we dive into the questions, I would like to tell you that this meeting is recorded, and your lecture will be online latest Thursday, maybe, on our homepage BWO-offshorewind.de. Simon, I would like to start with a very maybe too basic question, but it can't be told enough. What is the role of offshore wind in the overall system of the energy transition, and how must the tender design take this role into account? In a few sentences, maybe. Just to summarize.
Well, first of all, if we look at the decarbonization of the European economy and society, it will require large amounts of renewable electricity. That's very, very clear. And we have the situation that solar PV is extremely competitive at this point, but we're already seeing that its seasonal concentration and its concentration during the day does create certain limitations to the amount that you can do with this technology. Then when you look at onshore wind, which is also a very cost-effective resource and also should be deployed as much as possible, we do have the whole question of acceptance, of siting issues, and so forth. it already brings the advantage of having a stronger output during the winter time, where especially once we've electrified heating applications more, we'll need proportionately even more electricity. And now, of course, here offshore wind enters the stage because it has this vast potential coming from the North Sea, to some extent also the Baltics, and in a European perspective also towards the south. And it's a very low-cost resource with potentially higher full load hours. And I think this is crucial. When we go about the design and the allocation of projects, we should make sure that these high full load hours are really preserved, because this is something that increases the value of the electricity, because all the steps in the chain afterwards, the grid connections and so forth, are better utilized in that way and can be more cost effective.
Simon, let me also put you a question. The low number of participants in this last tendering round was mainly justified by the vast majority of the industrial experts by the low attractiveness of the sites. You mentioned it yourself. But one can now put oneself the question, in your opinion, how suitable are the current capacity targets or extension targets for offshore wind energy nowadays? Do they need to be supplemented by other targets, such as targets for generated kilo or megawatt hours and so forth? Because, as you have probably noticed, we have an ongoing and intensifying discussion in Germany of how the design could be changed, taking into consideration this actually the number of kilowatt hours produced.
So I think we need to differentiate here. You have the whole question of the supply chain and the certainty for the supply chain. And then you have the energy system planning and what we need in order to have an efficient decarbonization of the energy system. When it comes to supply chains, they actually look at the gigawatts, right? Because that's how the supply chain needs to be scaled. While if you look at energy system decarbonization, it's the gigawatt hours, it's the terawatt hours that count. Now, I don't think it would be helpful if we open a discussion on the overall capacities that we will have to decarbonize the German economy, because that would create additional uncertainty about supply chain ramp up. So personally, I think the more interesting question is, okay, how can we, via international collaboration, say that not all of this capacity would really be built in Germany's exclusive economic zone? Because this brings me to the energy system perspective of this. Of course, looking at maximizing the overall energy yield that is possible is something that overall leads to a lower price for the paid megawatt hour, which in the end is what's needed also to maintain the industrial base in Germany. So I think, yes, looking at a supplementary target also from an energy perspective can be very helpful, but we should go about this in a step-by-step way and making sure that we do not create additional uncertainty for the supply chains, because that, I think, would be the last thing needed.
Thank you, Simon. From your point of view, what was the biggest surprise for you in the tender results? And after this, I would like to ask you some of the questions we received from our audience. So please, what's the biggest surprise for you in the tender result?
Well, what I did find striking really is the reduction in the willingness to pay. But again, it's very difficult to properly attribute it, right? So the sheer order of magnitude of the change, I did find rather striking. And of course, it immediately begs the question, okay, when we extrapolate this trend, how is it going to continue? What does it mean for the following auctions that we're yet to see? I think that's probably the most striking feature. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Simon. And you can let's have a look over there, maybe on the screen where we received your questions. We start on the number one. And let me see. Okay, very important question, Simon. Is it possible to get the PowerPoint presentation shared? Maybe we share your charts.
Yes, no problem. That's perfectly fine. That's a straightforward question. Yeah.
Okay, and now the screen changed, unfortunately. Okay, now we can see it again. Can you please provide your thoughts on the amount of bidders participating over the different auctions and the reasons for this? You already did it somehow, but maybe you can.
I mean, we definitely saw a declining trend in this, and there can be a multitude of factors involved. I mean, if you go through it, in some cases, there can also be an influence in project pipelines, right, that are there. So if you have something that is already pre-developed and you want to make sure that as a company, you also go forward with deployment in whatever way, you'll be very sure to participate, maybe even make a strong bid in that. And once that's done, you wouldn't participate again, right? So there can be those effects. But then just the lower financial attractiveness that we see is one of the main reasons that we see this declining trend. And of course, increasing difficulties in the supply chain, because now we see that as deployment is taking up, more and more contracts are being locked in. Also, this creates additional challenges.
Thank you, Simon. Another question, which is also pointing at our next question round a little bit, is also a discussion which is ongoing now for years in the whole industry. And simply put it this way: can a system based solely on PPAs ensure the necessary investment security for the operators of the wind farms in the future in order to achieve the expansion targets? Because, as you know, for offshore wind, our system is based on PPAs, and now we have this ongoing or starting discussion launched or prompted by the paper by the BMWK, by the Economy Ministry. So what do you think? Do we need a change in the auctioning and auctioning design and the subsidy scheme?
So I think when we look at the question of the involvement of government and the type of instruments that you would have for underpinning the build out of renewable capacity, one needs to distinguish two things. One is, do you need such an instrument to really close a structural cost gap because there's a problem with the competitiveness? Or do you need such an instrument in order to mitigate risk? Because otherwise you would have higher financing costs leading to higher costs for consumers, while in the expected scenario, you wouldn't really need to make a regular payment. And I think more and more we're seeing this shift towards like a risk mitigation instrument or a hedging instrument that, you know, a market premium system or a CFD would be delivering. And I find something that is often underappreciated in the debate is the following. The capture price, the market revenues that you can generate, they depend on factors that are out of the control of people who will be investing in wind farms, right? It will depend on, okay, how much overall renewables generation do we have? Which portfolio of renewables generation will we have? What is with the grid infrastructure? What is with the demand? What is with the structure of demand? And how flexible is the system? And if you look at this going forward, there's a high number of uncertainties, and it's actually very unlikely, if you look at such a comprehensive transition of an economy in Europe, that markets will remain balanced. We will have a situation where things kind of, you know, don't fit together in an intermediate term, and that will be reflected in market prices. And so I think in order to ensure that we really get to the targets and we can really decarbonize the system, we do need to have an instrument to provide the investment certainty also for offshore wind, definitely. Last point on this. There's also an asymmetry in the risks that are there politically, right? Because you can have a situation during the transition where the generation is kind of long compared to the demand. And you can have a situation where generation is short compared to the demand, right? So whether you're building out kind of too quickly or too slowly. Now, the thing is, when you build out too quickly, you get, or when you build out quickly, you get depressed market prices. You can see that right now with solar PV, right? If you build too slowly, you get price spikes. You get very high prices for consumers. And politically, there's a strong disincentive to do that. So personally, I think there will always be an attempt to rather have a situation of oversupply, lower market prices than you would see at equilibrium. And for me, that creates an additional reason to say, okay, then we have an instrument to enhance investment certainty.
Very good argument. I never saw it that way. And now I would like to go on with our audience questions. Please scroll down a little bit. Okay, there was a statement before. The number 3, please. Yes. Okay, do you agree on this? It's from Björn Wittek. I think N-9.1 and N-9.2 are to be commissioned quite early in the comparison to the earlier bits. This only works with having the supply chain firmly in place already. The bidders were likely in the know that composition was limited, simply bidding lower. Plus, many of the developers have won a lot of projects in the last years and need to deliver now, reducing appetite for additional projects. Do you agree on this perspective, or is there anything you want to add on this?
I think both points are plausible. I already mentioned that we had a situation where a number of bidders were successful in the previous round. And also, if you look at the times when commissioning is taking place, especially now in a situation of a very tight supply chain, that kind of increases risks, or it reduces the amount of people that can participate, because of course you need to have a firmer view on whether you can actually deliver in time.
Exactly.
Okay, can you scroll down to question 5, please? No. Okay. The questions asking for the bid rationale are not stopping. We have another question here from Aditya. She's asking, what was the bid rationale? How can there be so different levels of willingness to pay compared to pre-developed and non-pre-developed sites? Any idea?
Well, yes, I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? And from all the conversations that we've had so far in this, and also, you know, speaking with multipliers and so forth, I have not come across somebody who really knows the very, very clear answer to this. I think it's a combination of factors. And in particular, since you have the single bid situation, you have much less of a situation where you're ramping up the bids. And then I think it's a story also of the full load hours, right? You have lower quality sites, and that immediately has an effect on the profitability.
Simon, I guess also we could answer this question, but it's a question from the audience for you. Is it known to which extent bidders were equal in the qualitative criteria, and hence the financial bid becomes in practice the sole deciding factor?
I must confess that I'm not familiar with the exact outcome. To the best of my knowledge, or that's kind of what we discussed before the event, these haven't been made transparent, and so we wouldn't know.
Completely right. We also asked the Federal Grid Agency for these bids, but we didn't get the exact bids. However, the next question.
Yeah, maybe before we come to the next question, maybe you can allow us a little glimpse into your study concerning the qualitative criteria. You already mentioned in your presentation a little bit, but could you elaborate a little bit on the changing needs concerning qualitative criteria in order that they can play their role as a differentiating criteria, and not so far as the case maybe, well, they do not, everybody knows that they do not play so much of a role in the today's auctioning design.
Yeah.
So Yeah.
I mean, of course, there's a number of factors to consider. If you look at the types of innovation that one could incentivize via such qualitative criteria, we've seen in other countries that concepts for an improved system integration were one element that did play a role. I think something where you could go also beyond what's currently being done to the contribution for the decarbonization of the supply chain is to include mechanisms by which you can incentivize the use of green input materials. So, for example, we have quite a high steel requirement in the offshore industry. We have questions how we can get the initial market for green steel off the ground. Of course, you need to do this in a way that you have sufficient flexibility in delivering on this target so that you might not have a physical obligation that that's exactly the steel you have in the turbine. But using these auctions to create a market pull in this direction could be one thing that is an interesting further development of the criteria. And let me say, of course, steps in this direction also play to the advantage of where we stand in Europe, because in Europe, we have a quite advanced discussion on the decarbonization of heavy industry. And by doing something like this, you also can enhance the resilience of the supply chain. So using sustainability criteria to also enhance the resilience component.
I see there are more and more questions from our audience coming up. So the next question is from Monika Morawiecka. Could hybrid connections solve the problem of wake effects, and how?
Well, a hybrid connection in itself doesn't solve it, right? I mean, if you put a wind farm right after, like if you look at the prevailing wind patterns, right behind a large wind farm, and then you connect it to two areas, it doesn't really do much. However, the thing is, if you see what are the regulatory changes that are necessary in order to expand deployment to a wider area, it's clear that it's the collaboration between different countries, and solving the issue of hybrid projects helps address this, right? So if hybrid projects become more attractive, the solution space becomes larger because you have a better cooperation between different jurisdictions. And for me, that would be the indirect way by which you can then reduce wake effects. But of course, I mean, the wake effect reduction is about having a consistent planning so that there's an overall optimum of where the sites are located. That's the only way of dealing with it.
So maybe we come to the question round 2 now with our questions.
Yeah, we could do, but are there more questions from our audience? I don't want to.
I think there are more questions, but we should try to raise them later when we come to question round 2.
However, okay, Simon, let's look ahead. In your study, you focus on the implementation of the projects and say that measures must be taken in the short term. Where does the fear that projects will not be realized come from, and what are the measures you propose?
So it's well known from auctions that they can have this winner's curse problem, right? I mean, we've seen them in renewable energy auctions around the world. Germany had its own fair share of experiences when it came to the auctioning of certain frequency bands for mobile communication. And if you have a situation where the financial attractiveness of a project starts to look worse and worse, and you start to compare it with applicable penalties and so forth, the payment structure actually becomes very important. And the way the German system is designed, the money that's been promised to the government actually doesn't have to be paid upfront. The vast majority, 90% of the payments actually are due during the operation phase of the plant. And that can then create an incentive where you say, well, okay, what I'm buying here is rather an option to build this farm, not an obligation to build it. And that you say, okay, I'm stepping back from actually moving ahead. Now, what is needed in such a situation is that you have a structured way that somebody else can pick up the project, either based on the fact that they have a different outlook on what situation will be happening in the market, or because for whatever reasons, the commercial terms by which they can construct the project are more favorable. And ensuring that there is such a secondary mechanism in place as a safeguard if projects were to be abandoned, we see this as one crucial lever to ensure that we actually have implementation of those projects that have already been awarded.
Another suggestion you are mentioning in your study is that you propose a change of the implementation deadline. Do you want to prolong it from 6 months to 12 months?
Yes. So what we were looking at in terms of how the deadlines are structured, if you see in which seasons you actually have the deadline in there, it can lead to a situation that due to systematically bad weather, you might miss it. And by prolonging it, you create a situation where this risk is mitigated. It's not about saying, hey, people, let's relax and all take more time. That's not what we need for reaching climate neutrality. But of course, if you set a certain deadline, it should be that the risks associated with maybe not needing it are proportionate. And doing this could be a way to take some risk out of the system without inducing really a strong delay in the overall deployment.
Yeah, for you, the measures that are necessary in the longer term include stronger cooperation in the North Sea and Baltic Sea, also to minimize the wake effects we already mentioned. Here too, there is a great deal of agreement with BWO, which is working in a working group with wind farm operators and transmission system operators to look specifically at the conditions for successful offshore hybridization. What are your starting points there?
As someone who's worked in international cooperation quite extensively, I think the single most important factor actually is political will. And that's something that, you know, is not easy to generate. And it's something that's very also can be challenging to maintain. I think there is a very strong role for the European level to show to member states that there is essentially money on the table, that if member states move in isolation, it's going to be more expensive. And the country that stands to gain the most in this actually is Germany. Why? Because compared to our neighbors, Denmark and the Netherlands, if you just focus on the North Sea now, our electricity demand is vastly larger. And if you put that electricity demand into the relationship to the exclusive economic zone, per surface area of exclusive economic zone, we have much less potential. So if we try to solve this in this somewhat arbitrary boundary, it's just going to be more expensive. And I think having this realization and then really being serious about finding compensation mechanisms and finding an economic framework, an agreement between different countries that can address this, I think this is necessary. Now, I'm not naive. This is something that in the current political environment is very, very challenging, right? If you look at just the state election results in Germany now, if you look at the situation in the Netherlands, we're not looking at a setup in which, you know, there's a natural embrace of such cooperation. But I think that the economic benefits that are there kind of speak for themselves. And so what's needed to get there, I think going further and demonstrating this economic opportunity to show really how much there is to gain, also in terms of just plain green energy by dispersing the 70 gigawatts from Germany in a more diversified manner, and finding also ways to create a package of cooperation that really works politically. To me, that's the main factor. All the other stuff, you know, the technical questions, how to deal with certain aspects of the regulation, they tend to flow from there.
William, can you change the next question, please, on the screen, because I cannot see it right now? Well, Simon, forgive me if we are switching the subjects or sometimes, but new questions arise, and well, this question, it might be also a question which could give the floor to the closing remarks, but I would like to put it here already. a question from Mr. Kramer. What chance or risk is there that recently awarded developers will abandon projects? I think you have already elaborated on that. But then he asks, and that is more important, the developers are more selective about their projects. So will Germany really continue to attract them? See the interesting results of CFD round 6 in UK today, which may attract them more again in the future to other markets. Well, I think it's a legitimate question to ask, where does Germany stand compared to its European competitors and the attractiveness of the market?
I think we have a mixed picture in the German situation. So if you look at the fact that actually it's not upon developers to provide the grid connection, and that the cost of the grid connection, at least nominally, is covered, is a situation that is more favorable compared to other countries. Now, of course, this is somehow countered by the fact that you have this uncapped second bidding component, where, of course, the rationale behind it is, hey, you're already getting the value of the grid connection, you're getting the value of actually using the area, so two very substantial economic advantages, and hence you have this competition going on there. However, if you have such an uncapped component, the financial attractiveness can go down, especially if you have quite a bit of competition, and that can hinder the overall attractiveness. I think looking forward, we already discussed this somewhat, increasing investment certainty by having a hedging mechanism that, of course, is compatible with also selling directly to the market via PPAs. Having such a hedging mechanism is an important part of the puzzle that is needed to really have a sustainable build out.
BWO, we believe that a strong set of industrial policy instruments is a condition for achieving the energy transition goals. Which industrial policy measure do you see as central in the expansion of manufacturing capacities?
So I already mentioned it from the summary of the analysis that we did. What we saw is that on multiple parts of the supply chain, you also have medium-sized enterprises that are now confronted with such a huge scale-up in the production capacity that they need to deliver, that it's very difficult for them to really deal with the associated risks and raise the necessary capital. So having effective guarantee and preferential loan mechanisms in place that allow for the ramp up of this capacity is definitely one critical element of the overall picture. Second point, again, I think this is something where we don't have a situation where there's a prospect of immediate political feasibility, especially if you look at the budget negotiations and how they went currently in Germany. Improving resilience comes at somewhat additional costs, right? And there has to be a way of kind of paying for this. If you look at the strategic petroleum reserve that was put in place after the oil crisis, it's actually 1,000 billion barrels of oil, which is really a multi-billion cost that is incurred by the member states of the International Energy Agency in order to have that safeguarding mechanism. So it's very clear we're paying for energy security for fossil energies at a quite high level. And if we look at energy security in a decarbonized world, that's about strategic manufacturing capacity. And I think we still have the issue that we need to put money behind this at the European level, that such investments go ahead. It was unfortunate that the Sovereignty Fund was not part of the package of the Net Zero Industrial Act, that really there wasn't fresh money committed to this, and Germany didn't play a positive role in this regard, on the contrary. And I think having this element on the table will be necessary to really have an effective strategy. But Europe needs to get its act together for building up some critical parts of the supply chain. Offshore wind is one example, but of course, looking at PV batteries and so forth is another one. Of course, it's not the objective to overdo this, but rather to create a balance and also seeing what are the options for friendshoring of capacities so that overall we just get rid of like single dependencies that could become critical.
One more question from our audience to the wake effects, and we see this is a very important upcoming topic. Does the 70 gigawatt target also consider the significant wind parks yield reduction recently presented by Fraunhofer EWIS? It was stated that this only could support 50% green energy coverage in Germany. Are we currently off target?
So I'd have to look at, we're currently in the process of updating our scenario Climate Neutral Germany, where we do have the same question, right? How much full load hours do we assume? We already, when we published this scenario in 2021, indicated in the study that part of this capacity should be built outside of the exclusive economic zone for efficiency reasons. And I think it was later in the process that in the German spatial planning, it was then concluded that the 70 gigawatt should go fully into the German exclusive economic zone. And I think we shouldn't be dogmatic about this. I mean, we had this conversation initially. If we find that, you know, you get the same amount of energy, even by reducing the capacity, if you place it more strategic, that's something we need to take seriously. We have to deliver competitive renewable electricity to safeguard the support for the energy transition. But at the same time, the conclusion shouldn't then be, okay, we raise, that was a different raise, that we cut the targets, but rather it should be that we find cooperation mechanisms to build this capacity somewhere else and have additional electricity available. Because this is something else that we're seeing in the update of the scenarios. The electricity demand is going up simply because we have economically attractive electrification options for more and more applications. If you look at, for example, decarbonization of long-haul trucks, electric mobility is advancing faster than was anticipated just a few years ago. So, you know, I don't think we'll have the problem that we have too much renewable electricity.
Thank you, Simon. I guess the study you mentioned from 2021, it's about decarbonization of Germany. Is it this study? Yes. And
yeah, Climate Neutral Germany 2045.
I remember you stated there, or Agora Energiewende stated there that 252 terawatt hours of 70 gigawatts offshore wind are needed for the system. So, and this means in the end that we need 3,600 full load hours in average for the offshore wind farms. I'm not sure where I read this, but I guess it was in Tagesspiegel Background this week, last week. There was a statement from a transmission system operator that with the current site development plan, and we could reach 200 terawatt hours within the exclusive economic zone in Germany. So from our point of view, there is a great need to change something in the site development. We need to speak about co-use to how to say to widen the space for offshore wind and to achieve some other or more sites for offshore wind energy, especially maybe we could also speak about using economic exclusive zones of our own neighbor states.
Well, maybe just to respond to that directly, I think maybe we can think about it as a three-step process, right? First is to really have a joint vision on how large the problem is. If you look at the study, Fraunhofer study, Fraunhofer EWIS, I think from the summer of June 2023 or something like that, that's one of the more recent sources that we've been looking at. You do see that in the overall planning, in the average case, you get to an energy yield of about 250 terawatt hours, right? So there it would be roughly in line with what is needed. So there, first question is, okay, where do we stand in terms of the analysis and also understanding the differences? Second, of course, if you relax certain restrictions within Germany's exclusive economic zone, you can deal with some of the wake effects, and I could imagine that some reallocations are more beneficial than others for reducing these wake effects. So that could be a second step, but I still believe that step 3, going beyond Germany's exclusive economic zone, is something that should really be prioritized. Why? Because it takes such a long time to get there, and I think the benefit that we can get from it would be quite substantial.
Thank you, Simon. More questions from our audience.
Difficult to assess. I think we will we'll take some of more questions later on. I would like now to bridge the gap and come to the question round 3 concerning the BMWK paper. Simon, what do you make of this paper? Because the BMWK has now started at the beginning of August this consultation process on the electricity market design. How do you assess the ideas of the BMWK presented in this paper, especially, of course, with regard to part 1, which deals with the investment framework for renewable energies?
So I think in a first step, it systematically lays out the different options that are there, how to continue with the investment support. And I think something that is crucial for the discussion and cannot be said enough is that a continuation of an explicit long-term instrument is totally critical to secure the build-out trajectory. For the reasons that I just mentioned earlier, right? That we can have this asymmetry where you have periods. So in the long term, I think we'll be happy about all the renewable energy that we can have. But in the medium term, there can be phases where deployment goes faster than the electrification behind it. You have a situation of oversupply, depressed market, all these things. So having such an instrument is desirable. Second, with the increasing competitiveness of renewable energies and also the experiences of the energy crisis, and frankly, what the European level now also gives as guidelines and guardrails for having such an investment instrument, you need to have a certain amount of clawback, so that once prices are highly elevated, the government gets something back. I think that's also needed to secure the long-term acceptability of such an instrument, and also to demonstrate that it's really a risk mitigation instrument rather than a subsidy. We've also at Agora Energiewende spent quite some time thinking about how such an investment instrument can be structured for renewables, and we find if you look, kind of read between the lines, I think there's also a slight tendency towards having an instrument that is independent of the physical production of an asset. And we also see that there is quite a number of advantages associated with that. I mean, maybe it's not the right place to go into all the gory details of this, but if you really have a CFD system that is really tied to the physical production of the asset, you get all kinds of warped incentives for the participation in short-term electricity markets. And actually trying to catch those and trying to fix those can create a quite tedious and complex system. And from our perspective, going to something that uses, and there's various options of doing this, but the basic principle is not linking it to physical production, but actually having a reference system, number one. Number two is creating options also for a sequential use of the instrument. So it could be left to the market to decide, okay, do I want a full 20-year package of a guaranteed mechanism? Or do I say, well, look, I can hedge myself on the market for the first years, and I just want to have a system that deals with the risks that are later down the road where the visibility is less. And then you could let market participants decide whether they want a 20-year a contract, or they say the first 5 years we wouldn't need one, and then in the 15 years afterwards, we would get this type of security instrument. So there's a number of things to consider here. We really welcome that the discussion is initiated. And we can go also into some of the other aspects of the consultation. Overall, it's clear we do need an overhaul of electricity markets. And I think one thing, apart from the whole questions around the capacity market, personally, is something that is really indispensable, although it's politically among the more difficult things, is stronger geographic signals in the electricity market. And for me, it is evident that there are very strong analytical reasons why continuing with a single price zone is not going to work in Germany.
The extent of this proposal, Simon, I think you will agree with me, is quite big, considering the time we have left to the next federal elections. And as an industry, we are posing ourselves the question, is it worth it? The effort and the turmoil which might be created from it, from these reforms. What do you think? Is it feasible, this kind of reform in the time we have left till the general elections? And also, I would very much be interested in what next to these proposals in this paper, what does this government still need to do in this election period till the end of the election period, and what might be left to another government formed by other actors with a wider majority, maybe?
Well, I think what we can observe with the difficulties of finding an agreement on the budget, and also some of the negative repercussions this has had for financing climate policy and the difficulty securing sufficient money for also the financing of the legacy plants in the renewable energy law, it really demonstrates the struggle and the difficulty that this current government has in terms of passing, larger packages of legislation. Now, of course, as part of the government of the agreement on the budget, there were a number of incentives or steps that were laid out in order to reinvigorate the economy, and this market design reform, for example, of course, being one of them. Personally, I think the biggest challenges we have also for the continued build out of renewables increasingly don't lie so much with the renewable sector. I mean, of course, all the things that I've said about offshore supply chains and so forth apply, but we have to look at grid connections. It's good that this is currently being consulted by the BMWK, that we see how we can expedite grid connections, but we really need to look at the demand side and how we get electricity prices affordable and reliably affordable for electrification. Because what's currently lagging behind, I would say, is more the demand side. That's also, I mean, we do assessments that are more comprehensive than just looking at the energy sector, right? We're looking at, okay, what do we need to get to climate neutrality? And there, it's the building sector, it's the transport sector, challenges that we have in industry. And I think that's where there needs to be a focus to make sure that these elements are actually properly taken care of. I would expect that we get quite a bit of discussion, and that's something that could also be helpful in terms of preparing. We had, for the first year now, that the Expert Council for Climate in Germany declared that Germany is off track to meet its projected 2030 targets at the end of June. I would say it's basically certain that this will happen again for the next projection report that will come out in March, with a later assessment by the council. So we'll go into the summer just before the elections, where it's clear that there needs to be an overhaul of the package of energy and climate policy. And I think that's a focus point that I think is very important to make sure that in that moment, and then with the start of the new government, there's clear legislative proposals on the table as a package.
Thank you, Simon. The end of this BWO expertise is already showing up at the horizon. We have only a few minutes left, so I would give some space, some room for the questions of our audience. And yes, I see lots of questions, how likely it is that projects will be dropped, but I guess you already explained the mechanism behind this, so I won't ask this again. Please, I see here a teleprompter, and this is also already answered. The next one, please. Maybe this, yeah, this could be interesting. Sorry, back again a little bit. The energy system perspective, it's from Monika Morawiecka. The energy system perspective calls for splitting the German price zone or introducing nodal pricing. This will incentivize the build out of electrolyzers and other new loads in the north, where they would be the most efficiently deployed. And this would reduce offshore wind curtailment. How much was it last year? Something about 20%, which seems to be much more important than wake effects from her perspective. It's a little bit like a statement, but what do you think about the current discussion about the strong price, electricity price zone split?
So I think first, because it's a very politicized discussion, it's always a good idea to look at kind of the energy system fundamentals that lead to this need for more differentiated market areas, let's put it that way. And the reason for this is electrification, flexible electrification. When we decarbonize heating, transport, and industry, the most cost-effective way of doing so is very often via electricity, right? Electric vehicles, heat pumps. We have battery storage systems also sometimes linked to them. And then, of course, in industry also you have power-to-X applications and so forth. Overall, in our scenario work, we expect in the 2030s to have up to 425 gigawatts of flexible demand in the German system, compared to a current peak demand of around 80. Now, the fleet of dispatchable power plants that will run on hydrogen, maybe synthetic fuels, right? This fleet is designed to meet the maximum residual demand in an efficient way of operating the system. Now, what happens if you have a single market zone in such a system where you have, let's say, somewhere between 40 to 60 gigawatts of dispatchable power generation running with a fairly expensive fuel, probably located, a lot of it is in the south, and you have these 425, or let's say many hundred gigawatts of flexible loads. On a windy day, we will, in a single market, in a single price zone, we will see very low prices, meaning that all this flexibility wakes up. You have very, very high demands in the south, also in the south. It will not be possible to transmit this also through the transmission system, because the transmission system also isn't designed to meet inefficiently high demand in the south coming from artificially low market prices. So all this stuff goes up, and then what we need to do in terms of redispatch is curtailing the renewables and finding another source to meet demand, which either means you need to throw customers off the system regularly, or you have to fire up dispatchable power plants with a marginal cost of several €100 per megawatt hour to meet a demand that has an economic value of maybe 10. And this is just something. This is a scenario that we're actively building, and because of this, I think it's indispensable to have these stronger geographic signals. Now, you can have long discussions whether kind of the redispatch system that we have in Germany is a kind of overlay system to deal with this. But personally, I think the risks that we have on the market, with the market result deviating more and more from what's actually physically happening to the system, they become larger. And therefore, having a stronger level of granularity is critical. There are always disadvantages associated with this. We have a very high liquidity in the single German zone. This is something where there needs to be due consideration to also preserve this to the extent possible. And the other thing is, and that's something where we also see a contribution from our side, in the coming months, we will publish a very detailed tool that will show what would electricity prices actually look at if we had a more granular setup, so that we can see what are really the political winners and losers in such a setup, because I think that's where the political opposition really comes from. And in order to have a rational debate on this, better understanding, okay, where are the real pain points, how can we resolve this, this is needed to move forward on this topic. And I agree with the advantages that were mentioned. One other advantage would be that in the northern part of Germany, the share of renewables would be so high that you can actually generate green hydrogen that conforms with the regulatory requirements on EU level based on grid electricity. So there's a number of systemic advantages. And I think to deal with the political issues associated with this, seeing better where the pain points are, how big the problem really is critical. And we also see that we get, more and more analyses that look at this topic and seeing that the spread isn't so large. So yeah, it's difficult, but I think if we all just take a deep breath, look at the numbers, see where the advantages are, it will move the discussion forward, keeping everything as it is. I hope I was able to explain that isn't an option.
Thank you, Simon, for this short question to this complicated topic. 11:30 is coming up, and it's time for some closing remarks and a very, very big thank you to you, Simon and Mira in the background. It is always a big pleasure to speak with you. In case we could catch your interest, dear audience, with this debate, I want to invite you to read also our BWO position paper on the debate about the electricity market paper of the BMWK.
To be published in the next week.
To publish, I just wanted to ask you, Man, published next week. And I want to invite you all to our third BWO autumn party on the 8th of October. We will have a look on the upcoming election of the German parliament, and we will discuss with political leaders the question, what remains to be done in terms of the tender design and how to strengthen the European value chain of offshore wind energy. Thank you to you all and have a nice day. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.